Why automakers won't make affordable cars. We don't need charts, graphs, all kinds of fancy numbers and colors. What we do need to know is one answer. And really that solution and that answer is profits. Profits are really what's driving a lot of these car manufacturers to create these very expensive vehicles. We're seeing the average transaction price bump back up again. We're up close to $48,000 and change. It won't be long before we're $50K. And yet we've seen some improvements over the last number of months. That's really only because of strong incentives, all kinds of discounts, rates off, all kinds of things to get people in the door. And while they applied some of these discounts, we're seeing prices that we're edging down, slowing down, and there was this feeling and this sentiment that prices were dropping. But they never were dropping. I mean, if you look at the base foundational pricing of a lot of these vehicle manufacturers, for example, the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price, a lot of that is going up. It doesn't matter what the end user sees. It doesn't matter you go online and you're able to get some special deal and they're giving you $2,500 off. Those are all smoke and mirrors because behind the scenes, they're raising the bar. And while we think this is great, oh, we're getting $5,000 off, the reality is on the back end, in most cases, other than maybe Stellantis, who's actually jacked up their prices significantly. In the last 5 years, we've seen price increases of over 60%. A lot of other manufacturers like GM have risen prices across the board by an average of 42%. And even Ford has cranked up their prices. We're seeing this escalating rates, but we're seeing rates that far overcome what we're seeing the cost of living increases. You know, inflationary rates, 3, 4, 5% year over year. We're not seeing that with the automotive sector. We're seeing much higher numbers. But why is this happening and why are they not building affordable cars? Well, we saw it during the chip shortage back in 2000, 2021, 2020, 21. And there was this feeling that with shortages, you couldn't get vehicles, there was a shortage, people had money, governments were handing money out left, right, and center. People had all kinds of money waving it around, but they couldn't get that car that they wanted. They either had to wait an extremely long time or they had to outbid the person next to them. Yes, in other words, they were a very competitive marketplace with low inventory and a strong demand. Meant that naturally capitalism drove prices up. That's kind of how supply and demand works, you know, in a capitalist society. Now, unfortunately, with a lot of these vehicles that weren't available, a lot of it was because of the chip shortages. The chip shortages themselves meant that a lot of these manufacturers felt themselves having to ration these chips. Yeah, instead of putting in everything, you know, Ford had their lower costs. You think vehicles like the Focus and some of these lower cost vehicles, you know, even Toyota and Honda had their small price point vehicles too. But the point is to put those to market in a vehicle that might only net them $1,500, $2,000 on a transaction, but we're putting the same equipment, that same electronics, the chips, to get those vehicles out to market. They quickly realize that, well, wait a minute, if we put that chip over in this other vehicle that's a more premium model, then what we're able to get is a much more bigger margin. Instead of that $1,500 or $2,000 net profit, maybe we can get $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 out of that vehicle and just produce maybe a few less of those vehicles, but we can ration these chips. And it sort of started there, and it got all of these OEMs started to think, wait a minute, maybe we're onto something. So they started to realize that you didn't have to sell the volume. A lot of these dealers are going away from the volume manufacturers and the sales. I mean, look, what we've seen from Ford, the Fusion was a lower cost sedan. They made those go away. Those were somewhat affordable. And this year, actually in November, we're seeing GM getting rid of, you know, one of their famous four-door sedans we talked about in last week's video. But every single manufacturer is slowly veering away from their smaller vehicles, their smaller price point cars. And while the exception of maybe Toyota and Honda, you know, I mean, Toyota, the Fit went bye-bye, but, you know, we've got the Corolla and the Honda Civic. Those are still relatively price point cars, but even those have gone up. We're seeing the price point base model, you know, the Honda Fit back in the day, we're talking in the mid-teens, you know, approaching 20 grand. And now, and that was loaded up. That was with a lot of features and a lot of options. And now the base Honda Civic, which is essentially their entry-level vehicle, you're going to have to pony up and spend at least $26,000, $27,000 just to get into a base Civic, and it has plastic hubcaps. So they're clearly giving less motivation to the buyers to get into those lower trim vehicles. And let's face it, we've seen surveys across the board that have consumers asking for more technology. They like their latest cell phones. They like their technology. They like all of this electronics. They wouldn't want to show up at work with their new car and have Jimbo over there just bought his new car and has all these great features and 11-inch screen, but everybody's sort of asking for that technology. They want that, they want that 11-inch, 12-inch screen. They don't want that little square screen in the middle. I mean, we look at Stellantis and some of their older vehicles, their older Rams, and they had these little 4-inch, 5-inch screen in the middle, and GM has that as a base model trim as well. But nobody wants that. And so they're doing away with a lot of that type of inventory. Manufacturers also realizing that the popularity's not there for lower trim levels, but they're also realizing, you know what, we can make much more margin, throw a few extra electronic widgets in there, and we're going to make a ton more money on every transaction. They don't really care about selling volume anymore. If they did, they would have many more of those $15,000, $18,000 cars available. But we're also seeing Mitsubishi and some of their low price point cars going away. Nissan, same storyline. Yes, well, they have the Versa. It's not a particularly popular seller. But a big part of the problem there is we have a reputation of durability with certain manufacturers like Nissan. Could you imagine if Honda or Toyota, maybe GM and Ford got on the wagon and created something extremely low cost, $15,000, $14,000, that was crank windows and a manual transmission, but with a reliable little drivetrain? I think that would be very, very popular. And not that you're going to sell those in masses, and I believe that's not the intent. But these manufacturers, they've got pressures and burdens from, this transition to electrification. They know that Ford, for example, they're losing money on the sale of every one of their electric vehicles, or at least that's the way they allege. They allege that they're saying they're losing tens of thousands of dollars on the creation of every one of their electric vehicles. Okay, so how do they make that up? Well, they make it up on the sales of their internal combustion engine vehicles. And while we're transitioning that to the EV marketplace, all of these manufacturers continue doing the same thing, whether it's Ford, Stellantis, General Motors, are all losing money, allegedly, creating a lot of these electric vehicles, or at least the research and development of that. And in doing that, they're having to push prices up a little bit on their internal combustion vehicles. Unfortunately, us as the consumers are getting sucked in to this eternal vortex. Is this ever going to change? Well, the way things are stacked right now, it's probably not going to change anytime soon. Some people feel that, by the end of 24, 25, we might start to see that shift. I'm not so confident in that. Unless something drastically happens with the political system that we're finding across Europe, United States, Canada, this trend just looks to be continuing on. The manufacturing of batteries isn't getting particularly cheaper. And while they're looking for solid state technology and other kinds of means to reduce the costs and give better range and get more people into that market, the bottom line is research and development still costs a ton of money. And this transition is likely going to continue on for another 5 to 10 years. Remember, a lot of these countries don't need to hit those target dates until 2030, 35. And I don't see the real pressure coming down to do something more aggressive until at least those days. As a matter of fact, once that happens, we already know that carbon emissions output regulations are pushing these manufacturers to say bye-bye to internal combustion vehicles. That's not going to be a thing. So to feel that we're going to get back into a place where we might get our hands on a $15,000 or $20,000 price point entry-level vehicle, I think it's some wishful thinking. I think, unfortunately, there's going to be some bumpy roads ahead. Now, will we start to see some lower cost electric vehicles? That's entirely possible. It all depends on what's going on with the chicken tax that impacts the big three manufacturers, Ford, GM, as well as Chrysler, Dodge, whatever. That's going to be the only place that they can make an impact is if they blow the doors open and allow the Chinese to run rampant. But that's not necessarily always a good thing either. But that's the only thing at this point is to put these big three in a check and balance. But then you wonder, okay, well, what about Toyota and Hondas? Yeah, they're not getting any cheaper either. And we've seen some pretty significant price increases from those manufacturers as well. So this isn't unique to the big domestic players. This is going on because they're realizing that they've got to underwrite, they've got to make this money to generate for the construction and manufacturing design of these EVs, but they're going to do it on the shoulders of their internal combustion vehicles. And this is just the sad reality of every vehicle in this space right now. And while Toyota's taken a little bit more of a conservative approach, and they're less inclined to come out full gangbusters and create these EVs, they're much rather more inclined to generate vehicles that are more hybrid or ICE or good combination. They look like they're really holding out as long as physically possible. Now, with all of that said, naturally, these car manufacturers are just cranking up prices year over year, month over month. And when we see these slight glitches and downticks in average transaction prices, that's all smoke and mirrors, at least right now. Because we know Stellantis has been one of the hardest done by, and really their own doing. I mean, they had this attitude of, we're going to start advancing and accelerating our electric vehicle space, and we're going to do it maybe at the slight impact to our ICE sales. But little did they realize, as their pricing went up in the last 5 years by 60%, it was an inversely proportional drop in the number of sales. They've gone from something like 1 million Jeeps down to 600,000 Jeeps in a few years. That's brutal sales. Absolutely devastating. Things are getting so rough, they're seeing thousands of people getting laid off in the factories because they're not creating the vehicles. You're not making the numbers, you don't need the workers. Don't need the workers, you don't need the volume of vehicles, you probably don't need as many facilities. Now what that's doing is the shareholders and all of the people at the top, they all want to continue seeing profits. So how are they going to do that? Well, if they're not selling the volumes, can they go back? Time will tell. Can they bring back a Jeep Compass that now costs, $18,000? Probably not when they're sort of stalled out at $40,000. It's not likely you're going to see that drastic a change. More likely what you're going to likely see is a stabilization. You're going to see prices likely level for a period of time. But remember, as they transition to EVs, that market's going to take over and the price of those vehicles aren't necessarily all that inexpensive. So if you're trying to get yourself a cost-effective, affordable internal combustion vehicle in today's market, don't hold your breath too long because likely it's just not going to happen. We are going to see more incentives. We are going to see more interest rate changes. And that's all going to fluctuate, again, depending on the politics and what the drivers are within the politicians at the power. That will have an impact. But the bottom line is, as long as these regulations pushing the entire globe in the same direction, it feels like the inertia is far too great. We've seen this going on in Volkswagen. They went too far EV, now they're on the verge of collapse. A lot of these manufacturers have gone too far and it's starting to burn real bad. Nissan, a lot of their global market share is in China. China is now adapting more to the EVs, and now that leaves, the orphaned Nissan products. They're just not selling the vehicles like they did. Things are getting desperate for every manufacturer. So we always hope and look for the best deals possible. And I definitely want to do my best to try to bring those deals as they come. Because a wide swath across the industry shows to me right now that we're not going to see anything too drastic. It won't be surprised, you mark my words, by April, May, June, we're going to see the average transaction price notch up over $50,000. This is where we're trending. We're at 48 right now. We've seen this recent trend upwards again. And I guarantee you that we're going to see these price increases continue on like we have been in the last 4 or 5 years. It's a sad state of affairs, but here we are. The idea of capitalism kicking in fast and furious. The idea of having a price point car that you can just get in, drive to work, just leaves a lot of people out of the market. It's a shame. There's fewer and fewer and fewer people able to afford a new vehicle. Do these OEMs really care? Not really. Not as long as they're selling the production numbers and the targets that the factory's setting out. So if they're raising these targets and they're making the profits, because really it's a commodity. It doesn't matter whether you're selling a car or a BMW or whether you're selling a can of Coca-Cola. It's a commodity. And it's all boiled down to profits. And so as long as the profits are rolling in, the manufacturers, the shareholders, everybody is happy. The pressures are off their backs if they're continuing raising profits year over year. And this literally looks to be the only way they can do it. I mean, especially with interest rates still relatively high, even if you were to drop 10, 20% off the average transaction price of every vehicle across the industry, I think you would only see a marginal uptick in sales. But then they are sacrificing the idea of making a profit per unit. So they're just follow the course. As long as we've got enough well-heeled buyers to buy these vehicles that we're throwing out there to market, and as long as their days supply inventory isn't getting out of control, these car manufacturers continue rolling with price increases year over year. Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. As well as always, definitely want to check out those videos. A great couple of videos, definitely for the archives. Hope to see each and every one in the next one. See you real soon. Bye-bye.